DemocracyNow.org, the War and Peace Report. See you in September. The army you have, the music. Well, the United Nations now says the death toll in the 11-month uprising in Syria has topped 7,500 as the Syrian government's crackdown continues on anti-government protesters and armed rebels. Activists say more than 250 people have died in the past 2 days alone, mostly from government shelling in Homs and Hama province. There are reports Syrian troops have begun a ground offensive on the opposition stronghold Homs, especially in the Bab Amr area. A Syrian official who spoke with the Associated Press vowed Bab Amr would be, quote, cleaned within hours. We're joined now by the Secretary General of Amnesty International, Salil Shetty, who is here in New York to meet with UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Amnesty has been calling for Syria to give humanitarian aid agencies immediate and unhindered access to Homs and other affected areas. Amnesty is also closely monitoring events in Iran and Afghanistan. In Iran, Amnesty has exposed a crackdown on freedom of expression in the run-up to this week's parliamentary elections. Meanwhile, in Afghanistan, Amnesty reports 500,000 Afghans displaced by fighting are struggling to survive in makeshift shelters in the harshest winter the country's seen in years. Salil Shetty, Secretary General of Amnesty International, welcome to Democracy Now! First, talk about what you have found and are calling for in Syria.
I think the media reports are giving you the picture already, but our staff on the ground, Amnesty International is not allowed access into Syria, as you can imagine. In fact, that's one of our calls, that independent human rights monitors, including the UN body, should be allowed access. I don't think we can describe it in any more gory detail. It's unbelievable. It's outrageous. Crimes against humanity. The numbers spiraling every day. I think thousands of people have lost their life, and tens of thousands have been injured and affected, including children.
And so what do you think, what are you going to be telling Ban Ki-moon?
Well, the concern we have is that the international community, and particularly the Security Council, has got paralyzed in this regard. I mean, of course, the Syrians themselves are fighting a brave fight. Initially it started completely as peaceful protests, and now it's ended up having to go beyond that. But there's a limit to what they can do from inside. So the international community has to rise up. And here, as you know, Russia and China are blocking any movement in the Security Council. And as far as the Russians are concerned, of course, they have some short-term, business interests, because almost 10% of their arms sales go to Syria. But our view is that it cannot even be in the interest of Russia's own commercial interest, to alienate the entire Arab League and the Gulf states. So our call on the Secretary General today certainly is to increase the pressure, to really push hard on the Chinese and the Russians to change their position, and allow the Arab League to do what it's really doing, what it should be doing.
The issue of armed intervention in Syria, where does Amnesty stand?
Well, right now the immediate issue is that the Syrian government has to stop the bombardment. That is the core issue, and allow humanitarian access. Now, Amnesty is not called for use of force. I mean, that's something which, we don't do, because we are not experts in the issue of using force or not. I think the immediate issue is really about allowing unfettered access to independent human rights monitors. It's to stop the arms flow, because the arms embargo, which we've been calling for a long time, has not happened. Navi Pillai has also called again for Navi Pillai, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, has called for Syria to be referred to the International Criminal Court. That needs to happen. There are other sort of issues which are getting less attention. For example, we have a team right now sitting on the borders in Jordan, and there's a massive flow of refugees into Jordan. And many of these people who are coming out into Jordan and Turkey, unfortunately, are being pushed back by some of these governments back into Syria, which creates an additional risk for them. And the asset freeze, there's not been a systematic asset freeze on Assad and his family. These are the things which we feel can make a difference. Of course, we need a broader political settlement. Amnesty's general view is that increasing the flow of arms into Syria can't really help anybody.
You think Assad should leave? There's word that Tunisia might be offering him asylum.
Yeah, I mean, in most of these places, as you know, even in Egypt and Tunisia, it's not just a question of the dictators leaving, because we have to see an end to dictatorships. So it's not just Assad. It's a system which has to change. It has to be the full observance of international human rights standards. It's not just a matter of one person, because Assad is surrounded by a whole group of people who are violating international human rights law and humanitarian law. So I think Assad is in a sense iconic, but it goes beyond Assad.
Iran and Syria, there is a connection between the two. Talk about that connection and what you are seeing in this lead up to these parliamentary elections Friday.
The elections are going to be taking place in early March, and that has really heightened the issue of the domestic human rights violations inside Iran. And our worry is that because of the Arab Spring and now because of this whole whipping up of anxiety around Iran's nuclear program, what is happening effectively is that the Iranian government is getting away with a massive increase in human rights violations in the last few weeks. And we have a report which we released just a few days ago which describes this in great detail. So I think the first thing is to bring a focus back onto the Iranian domestic human rights violations. That's absolutely crucial. Very on the ground what we are seeing, let's not forget that since February 2011, which is when the first initial protests inside Iran started, we have key opposition leaders like Mousavi, Karoubi under arrest, not just them, but their families as well. But in the last few weeks, what we've seen is, a spate of unfair and arbitrary detentions of artists, journalists, students, and the most recent one is a sort of a cyber army that they've created to start tracking internet bloggers. And most recently, we have a situation where Mohammad Khazali has been one of the bloggers, well-known bloggers, has been arrested for 4.5-year term plus 10 years of what they're calling internal exile. BBC journalists, I'm sure you're aware, the Persian service, one of them was arrested as well. So a lot of harassment is happening right now. So our call on the Iranian government right now really is to allow for public debate which needs to happen before the parliamentary elections, and allow for international human rights obligations, basic freedoms, freedom of association, expression, assembly have to be in place. You may be aware that in 2011 the number of executions which have happened in Iran is 4 times as much as happened the previous year. And many of these are also cases of juvenile executions, all these so-called drug offenses. And juvenile execution is absolutely prohibited under international human rights law. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in Iran, and our worry on Iran is that somehow they're not in the focus anymore because, and as you said, it's very linked now to Syria as well. And the paradox, of course, is that the Iranian government was welcoming what was happening in Egypt and Tunisia and Bahrain, but they are not ready to accept their own people expressing their opinions and voice.
And what about Amnesty's position on crackdowns in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, human rights abuses there, which are traditionally U.S. allies?
No, those are the elephants in the room. Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, it really exposes sort of double standards. It's true that the U.S. government has voiced some concern in Bahrain, but we have one of our people right now in visiting Bahrain, and the number of restrictions we have even on our staff entering now is increasing on a daily basis. They want us to take permissions, etc., which is simply not possible for us to do. As such, Amnesty never enters a country unless we get government permission, so which is why we cannot enter into Syria and Iran. But Bahrain has historically been more open, but now they've really tightened on any independent monitoring. So Saudi Arabia, in my view, is simmering. We don't really hear much about what's happening there, but and the U.S. government's behavior in relation to Saudi Arabia and Bahrain is not any different from what they've historically done, which is to put their interests ahead of their values.
We only have a few minutes. I want to get to Egypt, but I want to ask you about the arms trade first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the reasons we are here this week. The arms trade issue is very central to what we're discussing. I mentioned we had ships landing in Tartus, Russian ships landing to support the Syrian dictatorship, and this is symbolic of the deeper problem of unregulated arms flow across the world, billions of dollars of business interests. The paradox here again is that the Security Council members, the 5 permanent members plus Germany, account for almost 70 to 80% of arms trade in the world.
So, U.S. in particular?
The U.S. is a big contributor. So obviously you have a conflict of interest in some ways, literally. But the issue really is that finally we are close to having a sort of global arms trade treaty in place. This unfortunately is not getting much traction in the U.S. media, etc., because it's tended to become a UN internal process. It really needs to become much more
visible. And what has been the U.S. position on the Arms Trade Treaty?
So the U.S. position is generally supportive that there needs to be an arms treaty. I think, the main issue for us is what we're calling a golden rule, that any arms trade, before it happens, it needs to be tested to see if it's going to lead to human rights violations. Now, on this particular issue, the U.S. has been a bit more cautious, and their argument has been that they have domestic regulation, which is already quite strong. But we don't really understand that argument, because if they do have stronger domestic regulation, then there should be no worries in signing up to a global treaty which is powerful. Because the worry is not just about U.S., but it's about China, Russia, Iran.
Why is the U.S. resisting?
I mean, there's always a historical resistance to anything which is international. So there's always these arguments about sovereignty, etc. I'm sure they want to reserve some of their rights around the sort of so-called war on terror. There's all of those things happening. But I think part of the reason is that people have not really focused on this, and that's one of the things we want to speak to Ambassador Rice today as well about.
Finally, you've just returned from Egypt. Talk about the significance of what is happening there now.
Well, changes in Egypt are massive. Just to give you one example, but the fact of the matter is that, as I said, the dictators have gone, but the dictatorships haven't. So just when you enter into the airport, when we were walking in with amnesty materials, we get stopped at the airport at the customs guy at the front end. Historically, when amnesty people enter, you get interrogated for hours. You're made to wait. And the same thing happened to us. The guy said, "Can you wait? I have to check your materials." And then he called his boss, and his boss came and said, "What's wrong with you? This is the new Egypt. You shouldn't be doing this." But it's going to take a long time for that to change. But the big issue right now is the behavior and the practices being followed by the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, the military generals who are running the country right now. One of our big concerns is the use of military trials.